Today I am joined by Ed West. Ed West is a British author, a journalist, and blogger, the owner operator of a substack called The Wrong Side of History, and the author of many, many books, among them The Diversity Illusion and Small Men on the Wrong Side of History. Welcome, Ed.
Thanks. Pleasure.
It's lovely to have you here. I also, in my research on your past deeds and writing, you've written many books, but I feel like this I could not mention this because similarly to me, you've had kind of a previous career in writing. And one of your books is called How to Pull Women: The Science of
Yeah.
Seduction. I had to
I
bring
think,
this
yeah,
up.
I think I go there. Yeah. I mean, I've had a very, very shady life. No, I used to work
Explain yourself.
back in the noughties when I first went into journalism and I was kind of drifting into I don't know what kind of career. I worked at men's magazines, which was kind of funny. It was a very big phenomenon in the late 90s and um, noughties, and then it sort of started in England, and then they went to America. But they were very, by today's standards, they were incredibly racy. I mean, basically, and they became more and more racy, and basically became pornographic. Um, and looking back, it's kind of shocking. I mean, they would be more shocking to today's morality than like 1950s. Anything from the 50s is strange. But yeah, at the time I wrote some sort of like small toilet books, and one of them. I mean, it's ironic. I mean, I also wrote a book about grooming, and I'm the most unkempt person imaginable you can see. Yeah. So those are yeah. So
I
obviously,
thought that was interesting, just because I feel like I have a kind of a similar, past. Not necessarily, writing about pickup, but I used to be a columnist for Vice,
I wrote.
and you used to do essentially what made to order stuff. Like for example, I had one like why the small town I was from is a terrible place or something like that. And I just had to trash my hometown, which now looking in retrospect is just like, oh Lord. I did a pretty good job of it. It had a lot of viewers, but
I think
a
Vice.
lot. Sorry.
Sorry. I think Vice was. I don't know if I wouldn't say descended from the men's magazine thing, but it was quite similar in tones, like Loaded, which was the first the men's magazines here. So there was that kind of thing. So a lot of journalists then start in those kind of things with the aim of getting into more substantial stuff. By the way, it wasn't like a pickup artist book, by the way. I mean, I've read The Game and I thought it was a very interesting book, although it gets very depressing and sinister towards the end. It was supposed to be just like a comedy guide, like a funny, light-hearted. I mean, I'm the absolute worst person to write it, but there you go. I mean, yeah, and now here I am as a.
Yeah, I mean, you're obviously a more serious, literally a scholar at this point. But everyone kind of starts at one point. I just found it really interesting because, like you say, there's some certain things that like I didn't study to be a journalist, and I kind of wanted to get into journalism. And what I did is write, a Vice stylistical and send it into Vice, and the Vice were like, "This is kind of shitty. If you correct it in these ways, we're gonna, pay you, I don't know, the equivalent of $10 to write articles for us." So yeah, that
That's
was
great. I mean, and at the time, that feels like wow, amazing.
it was so cool because it was the only publication that was a little bit not communist. We used to describe everything that was around us when we were growing up, like teenagers or your early 20s. Everything that kind of had this heavy old timey feel as communist. And Vice was so stridently not communist that it was the best place to work for. And I knew this one guy who worked for Vice, and he was seen as like this, this floating god entity. And it's like whenever he showed up at a party, it was like, it's the Vice guy. Maybe he's gonna write about us. So I thought, if this dude can be the Vice guy, maybe I can be the Vice woman. So I tried my hand at it, but it was a pretty crazy time at that point. And another relic from that time, which I think a lot of people maybe look back on with cringe and maybe not regret, but like it's just a product of the time, is a confessional essay. I don't know if you know that, like a lot of
Yeah,
women did that, like Exo Jane style confessional essay, like pages upon pages of, I don't know, I felt so strong, so strange when his hand was on my shoulder. And I feel like just like that confessional nature of the early internet, and just putting it all out there, and kind of waiting for a reaction. It was just like there was a time and place for that stuff. And I feel like
it's very exploitative. I read there was Sarah Dykson wrote a really interesting piece about it once. I think it was for Unheard, and she was going through all the most famous ones. And whenever these women, and it's always women who write them, and their entire life be detonated, they'd be completely, their whole Google search was completely ruined by this. They'd have hundreds of people calling them all sorts of things. They'd admit to being a completely pathetic person. And they'd get paid like $70. Oh God, this is so terrible. This is so exploitative. It's just basically encouraging desperate people trying to get into the media to, humiliate them.
It was an easy way to get, 15 minutes of fame. And for like a hot minute at that point, it was really interesting. Like people at the parties would say, oh, I understand how you felt when you were in that awkward sexual encounter with that dude and whatever. So you would kind of get that feedback. But outside of those circles, you'd essentially detonate your your reputation for nothing. So to move beyond the sordid past of internet history, your latest book, "Small Men on the Wrong Side of History," which is a very good title. To be honest, like I remember that. That's one thing I remembered about you and your persona. There's something about this whole concept of the wrong side of history that's great, and I love that you also named your Substack that. Is about the failures of post-war British conservatism, and you've also had some things to say about what's happened recently. I mean, the whole UK is ablaze now in more ways than one about Boris Johnson leaving office and his potential successors. I mean, how does the situation on the ground feel as someone who's essentially been diagnosing these problems for a while? I mean, what's your feeling as one of the major diagnosticians of conservative failure?
I don't know. I'm always such a voice of doom and bleakness. Basically, there's about 8 or 9 serious candidates now. Rishi, the Chancellor, I suppose he's probably a favourite. I don't think he's like a very good political operator. He had this thing where he's this kind of non-dom status thing with his wife, who's a fantastically wealthy Indian woman, and there was a sort of feeling that they basically had to declare that the UK would not be their primary residence in the next 5 years. The rules are basically to sort of minimize your tax. You're sort of stating, and there's obviously a good reason for the non-dom thing. You want to attract the kind of, the very elites of the world. But it was basically a statement of, our future isn't in the UK. We're going to move to Malibu along with all the other sort of rest of the sort of, moving global elites. And you think, like, if you're going to be chancellor and presumably you want to be prime minister, you should have at least some investment in the country, or at least pretend. And that suggests someone who's not very good political operator. I mean, it's easy to say that because he's like fantastically rich, so he's inevitably going to sort of attract certain amount of resentment, and he's younger than me as well, which makes it bad. So he's the front runner. Liz Truss is also she's like a liberal, but like not in a bad way. She's quite anti-progressive, but she's very much. She made this quote about the young generation of British people were sort of Uber riding freedom fighters, which really grated kind of conservatives at our end, at the sort of more, I don't know, more post-liberal kind, because it was kind of like, this is everything we hate about what's happening. And also, I don't really think young people particularly want freedom that much. But then there are the other candidates, like Penny Mordaunt, who was quoted to her book when it mentions about, how terrible white privilege is. And you just think, why are you in the Conservative Party if you actually, if you use that? That's her phrase is a bit of a. And Tom Tugendhat is also. A lot of Conservatives don't like him because he basically denounced Roger Scruton when there was this sort of New Statesman interview and he was stitched up. So I mean, I guess the bright young hope is Kemi Badenoch, who's just sort of announced things. The thing is, she hasn't got much experience. She's young again. She's had about, the comparison, she's had about much experience as David Cameron had when he took over the party, and he didn't turn out to be very good, I don't think, in my opinion. So, I don't know. I mean, Boris felt like it was just basically like a wasted opportunity. He had this enormous majority. He could have done anything he liked. And it was just, I mean, I know there's COVID, but it was all sort of, it was all drama, wasted on drama.
Yeah.
I'm just trying this.
Yeah, it seemed like Boris always had very good intentions and he made them public, and then he backed out seconds before it was crunch time, which is very interesting because he was supposed to be kind of our guy in a way. He's very like classically trained individual.
Yeah.
He's definitely learned lessons from history, but I don't also understand exactly what the mechanisms are around someone like the prime minister and exactly how much leeway and executive power he actually has.
Yeah, there's
Um,
quite a lot. I mean, the British Prime Minister has a lot of power. He could have, I mean, for example, there's like the main bugbear for people like me on the internet, stuff like the Equality Act, which the Labour installed really weeks before they left power in 2010. And that shores up. Whenever there's always complaints about, oh, wokeness and education wokeness and HR, whatever wokeness, and we can talk about what that means. But that's enshrined in British law. That's why it's there. I mean, if you could get rid of some of it's cultural, but a huge amount you could just get rid of the law. We don't need it. We don't need these kind of like targets. We don't need equality of outcomes to be a thing. And then there is stuff like the Communications Act, another Labour thing. Lots of in Britain we have lots of cases of people. Recently, a man was jailed for 4 months for making jokes on WhatsApp about George Floyd. I mean, I don't know how offensive the jokes were. Maybe they were disgusting. I don't know. But I mean, newspapers don't even print what the joke is now. So someone shouldn't be going to jail for that. It's ridiculous. People shouldn't be having the police coming around and interviewing them because of their views on the trans issue, which happens a lot in Britain. And these are things the government could have just changed. They could have just said, right, we're changing the law now. And Boris had this huge majority, but he just had I say this to someone in the media, he had a very, very typically journalistic, chaotic life. He's three times married. When he became prime minister, he was homeless. He was living at his girlfriend's place in South London, where they famously had a row. It was just so chaotic. I mean, Dominic Cummings, who is sort of, the Thomas Cromwell figure to carry Anne Boleyn, these figures within the court. I don't know how much everyone will know that historical analogy there, but this kind of chaotic court with a middle-aged man who takes an interest in young women, and that leads to the court kind of becoming more and more chaotic. I mean, he alleged that Boris was too busy to attend these Cobra meetings when COVID arrived. Cobra is the sort of national security meetings, because he was writing this biography of Shakespeare, which he had to write to pay for his second divorce. And you just think, like, how is that possible? Like, how can you be such a chaotic person? And then I think, the most telling story of his time was, he did the dog airlift of Kabul, which was like such a British story. We're withdrawing from Afghanistan, and the British Prime Minister orders, I suspect at the behest of his wife, who's a big animal lover, as British people tend to be, that these dogs in Kabul, which were part of this dog sanctuary, had to be airlifted out of the country, which is just so insane. Such a strange use of resources for British personnel. To me, it kind of epitomized the stupidity and the shallowness of the whole thing. And so, he said 3 years, okay, he had COVID, the whole thing, blah, blah. But what have they got to show to it? I mean, there's nothing really you would know. There's nothing to suggest that we've had a Tory-led government for 12 years. In the same way that Blair had 13 years, Blair and Brown, New Labour had 13 years in power, and they transformed the country. Margaret Thatcher, 11 years, she completely transformed the country. Huge, huge differences after, whether you like that or not. She had a vision of what the country should change to. And the current government have just basically done nothing in that sense. One or two things tinkering around, but
Yeah. Do you think that that's partly because they, at heart and at bottom, they essentially agree with the vision of the world that the left has? Uh,
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, Boris Johnson is very much of that social milieu. I mean, I always think it's telling that. For example, his sister-in-law is a campaigning Guardian journalist, a very, very successful. Nothing wrong with it. She's a very successful journalist who exposed the Windrush scandal, which was the previous government. His father was a Remainer activist campaigner. His sister is a a Tory Remainer. That's fine. The Brexit debate, I'm not particularly partisan on that. But he is from that kind of socially liberal. He lived in North London when he was mayor, which who's outside. Tories tended to historically live in West London, and liberals and progressives in North London. He's very much part of that. They think is they agree with the progressive kind of agenda. They just want to slightly slow it down, maybe. But and as a classic example, Brexit was undoubtedly, it was a vote on immigration. Like you can look at what people said. What was the reason for it? It was immigration. It was people saying this was their first chance to vote on that issue ever, because there was no real way of opposing it, because the Tories did nothing, and the electoral system means it's just very hard to. And even the way it was phrased by the Leave campaign, they knew it was about immigration. That sovereignty, that meant the right to control the borders. And now we have record immigration as a result. I mean, it's so farcically stupid. I don't even know. You can, as a historian, in the future, how do you even analyze the motives of people? Often when you think about history, you think, why do people do something which is obviously so counter to their interests? And it's happening in our time. We can see it.
Yeah, I mean, the people who are doing it and the people also in Tory leadership are essentially leveraging populist energies for power, but then they essentially still ascribe to the same elite creed, kind of
Exactly.
neoliberalism.
It's undoubtedly that way. I didn't know what. I would like to see, because I'd like to see conservatives sort of make out this is actually what we philosophically believe about the world. This is like 10, 12 points. We believe these things are good. This is true, blah, blah. And we're going to work as a sort of standpoint from that. Often, obviously, some conservative candidates have said, "Oh, we're going to stop this woke nonsense" or something. It's always phrased in this kind of tabloidese way. I don't know. What do they mean by that? I don't know. What do they mean by wokeness? I don't know. I think it's mainly focused on the sort of fripperies and stuff like statues, maybe a few pride flags, but they don't really know. They don't really have an idea of what that really means or what kind of they can offer. I fundamentally believe that the kind of progressive vision of the world is just wrong. It's based on fundamentally untrue things about human nature, and it's based on a completely utopian vision of the world, and it places too much emphasis on the unusual rather than the average. And it's very much directed by people, some of whom have quite clear mental health problems. On social media, for example. I know we should counter that. We should say this stuff isn't true. It's not like we want to slow this down and have it a bit later. It's just not true. We have a different vision of the world. We want something else. And I don't think. Sorry, I'm starting to rant now, and I'm just going to turn as my parents. This is everyone. This happens to everyone.
Yeah, this happens to fewer and fewer people. I think you actually. I don't know if it was you or someone has written an article recently just saying that this conversion to conservative that was just typical for a very long time. It's just not happening for kind of more younger generations like millennials and things like that.
That's the whole thing, the thesis of the book, basically, that if from around the mid 1970s, if around then or the early 80s, people born around that point onwards, that doesn't happen. Most people between the age of 30 and 40 would become conservative. Not most people, but a huge number. And that was tied into certain kind of stages in life. A big factor is basically, the number of children people having. If people have children, they're much more likely to become conservative. There's loads of studies on that. There's been a huge drop in the number of people starting families. Part of it is due to the housing situation, which is kind of basically the chief problem in Britain now. I know the housing is expensive everywhere. In London, it's been insane for years. And it's gone from being kind of mildly amusing insane just really deeply depressing. It's impossible to anyone really to get on the property ladder. So people that have houses, they can't afford. It's a sort of longer expansion of higher education also kind of allows progressive ideas to be spread amongst much wider section of the population. Even if they're not, I'm not even sure. You don't even need active communist lecturers indoctrinating people. I'm not sure that actually works with that. I just think it's more like the cultural setting of university just basically makes progressivism the kind of norm. So there's a kind of range of obviously religion a massive point. So religious decline, And even if people aren't religious, if the kind of vibe around them, the culture around them is vaguely still Christian, then that will kind of implant Christian, sort of conservative norms around them in ways hard to explain. And once that sort of disappears, then progressivism basically becomes the substitute religion, which is seen in America. I mean, the drop off in religious attendance in America must be the most significant kind of social trend of the 21st century so far. It's been huge. And it's not a coincidence that as Americans have stopped going to church, their politics has gone completely mental. In the last 20 years, it's just become so much more extreme. I mean, I would say it's more extreme on the left in the sense that, the Republican Party has lots of really, really crazed people. And to my decadent European is really some crazy ideas, but they just don't have the influence on Europe that Democrats do. So, they tend to be, things like gun control and the climate and stuff. Even, since the abortionist to some extent. But they just have no impact on Europe. While the crazy wing of the Democrats, what they say will be, copied by British politicians in like a year's time, even if it's completely irrelevant to Britain.
Yeah, I think there's a huge kind of ingredient in this. I feel like is technology and kind of media propagated by different technologies, because I mean, just the vision of what life should be like and what to strive towards and what to avoid has essentially, even for people like me, been set by what we've seen in media, which has mostly been created in Hollywood or in somewhere in the West by some person who's very probably liberal and wants to impart these ideas.
Yeah.
Like,
it's often dysfunctional person, and obviously, and as you grow up and meet them, they're very unhappy, dysfunctional people. You never seek life advice from them in any other way. I mean, you're a bit younger than me, I think. Pretty sure you are, a fair bit. But looking back on the kind of, I don't know, the ideas that I sort of grew up with that were in the ether when I was growing up, were all completely, were just all wrong. This kind of, I just think about the kind of the anti-common sense we grew up with. Bullies are just sort of vulnerable people who bully because they feel, because they feel afraid of. No, they're not. They're bullied because they're strong and they enjoy it. I mean, it's like all these kind of silly memes in the 80s that basically started in the 60s because there's a sort of cutoff from kind of deeper wisdom and older common sense. I think that's those ideas have now kind of spread through universities towards 50% of the population, and then they become the norm. So people have a completely I don't know, an unrealistic view of the world, unrealistic view of human nature, which has just become the standard. The standard, kind of the model of liberation. We're not actually biological creatures and act in obvious and predictable ways.
Exactly, and that all of life's tragedies, derive from a lack of freedom, or that there's someone's boot on your neck, and that's why
Right.
you're depressed, or like the most mentally ill people in this world have the most kind of complicated ideas of who's oppressing whom, and how they're
Right.
affected by all of this stuff. Um, yeah, it's a very strange thing, and like you said, this also ties into the decline in population. Is something that you've written about as well. And there's a kind of a quote from one of your pieces on this, and it references someone else's work. It's I'm just going to quote it here, but I think it's a really nice kind of um, summary of what one needs to consider if you're at the head of a country, and what to do about the fact that we're looking at the like demographic collapse. So the quote is, Moreland talks of the trilemma facing aging nations, whereby you can have two of the three: ethnic continuity, a thriving economy, or a comfortable lifestyle without the huge stress of mixing raising children and a modern economy. Israel has sacrificed the latter. Japan has chosen to take the economic hit, while Britain's leaders have given up its ethnic continuity. But that, alas, was a short term solution, since young immigrants don't magically avoid the fate of father time any more than the rest of us do. So I think this is a really good encapsulation of the fact that this is not just coming, it's here. And there are some solutions, but they're all essentially kind of Ponzi schemes. They're not really addressing the problem. And to me, it feels like this is the greatest problem that we're facing. And it's not just because I'm looking at statistics and I'm looking at, spreadsheets and, the data says so. It's because I viscerally feel it around myself. I felt like for my generation and my cohort, my friends, my girlfriends that I grew up with, I almost made kind of a revolutionary act to decide to get married and have children, because, it was very much out of place. Even my friends here in Romania, people say this is a backward country. Well, it's keeping up with the West in many ways.
Right.
And
We've got it
obviously,
worse in many ways. Romania is in Paul Morland's book, it's very bleak, a lot of it. But there is a sort of, the worst affected are places like Romania and Bulgaria. And Ukraine is a super case now, which is low birth rates, but also not as wealthy as Western countries, so losing huge numbers of people to. Britain has 1.2 million Romanians that we know of. I think the number's brilliant. Where I live in North London is actually, it's interesting. Probably the most Romanian part, because North London was originally where the Greek Cypriots went. The Turkish Cypriots followed them, and you'll often find with one community will follow its near neighbours. And I think that is the sort of path dependency that afterwards Bulgarians and Romanians then follow. I don't know if
know what happened. I'll tell you. Are you referring to kind of maybe Golders Green area and not?
Well, the Greek area is Haringey, where I live, and then they go up ladder. And
there's a bus route. There's a bus route from Luton Airport that goes through the north. And the first bus stops there, people just thought they were in London. I've talked to people who live there, and they said, okay, this is how the first settlements. So essentially, they got off the bus. They were like, oh, London. Okay, we get off the bus. And this is, they went around. They looked for housing because, people have signs for rent, whatever there, and started to look. That's apparently at least part of why all around the bus route, you'll see little enclaves of Romanians.
That is very interesting. So when migrants from the Caribbean came in the 40s, they arrived at Southampton docks and they went to Victoria. And Victoria in central London, on the Victoria line, 3 stops down is Brixton. So Brixton became the hub of the Caribbean community. Similar case, I think Leeds, there was one Sikh man in the 30s who went to Leeds, and then that basically became based on that. So I didn't, okay, so that makes much more sense. I thought it was kind of, because the Turks followed the Greeks. But so anyway, 1.2. I think a half of all Romanian medics have left the country since 2008, since CEU. So, at the time, I remember when it happened. So there was a much bigger migration of Poles and of the other AE8 things. And then when Romania and Bulgaria, I think that the A2 thing might have actually been a slight straw that broke the camel's back in terms of numbers here, because there was, the media reaction was, politicians, these right-wing politicians say we're going to be flooded or something. I don't know if that word was used, but there was no sense that actually migration is, in the modern world with modern technology, modern communications, is actually much bigger than anyone can possibly imagine. There are huge, financial and other incentives for moving, and that can have huge effects both on the country where people are leaving from and the country where they're arriving. So in the case of Romania, which has had below replacement fertility, that's going to have a huge. I wonder if overall, obviously, like, communism was terrible. There's no doubt. Communism obviously much worse than whatever followed. But the long-term impact of the Eastern Central Europe, the demography of people leaving at that rate is astonishing. Unless Romania becomes significantly wealthier and there's a move back. I think maybe that will happen in Poland, because Poland's becoming a lot.
Yeah, I think Romania kind of got into the European Union at maybe looking backward and from the future backwards, it's going to be kind of an auspicious moment, because it will empty the country, and the country's still emptying as we speak. But the Westons is, there's things happening in the West, and I know a lot of people are coming back from places like the UK, from Italy, and building here. There's still kind of a bit of.
That's optimistic. I'd like to believe the kind of optimistic. I'm not sort of anti-neoliberal in the sense that I generally think, globalization is overall good force, and if it's not taken to extremes like anything, it can be great benefit, and it's good that people get wealthy. So I suppose there is the optimistic line that as these countries become wealthier, a lot of people will want to move back, and it wouldn't have such an extreme effect. But we haven't really seen evidence of that. I mean, at current rates, apparently, Britain is going to fall behind Poland in about 12 years at our current GDP projection. That's GDP per capita. And that's from a huge, disadvantage after communism. So presumably at that point, I mean, Britain is not such an attractive destination. But I mean, the main problem we've all got is just that there are so many old people compared to young people. I mean, it really became noticeable at COVID. I mean, I don't know if you were like waiting for the vaccines, because I was in the 40-somethings, right? Now it's the 70-something. They start with the 80-somethings and the 70-somethings. We were waiting like weeks and months for them to get through all the old people. And I'm like, wow, it really reminds me of this country. And then after that, like they just shot through the 20s, the 30s and 20s. Like there aren't, and if there are places in England, I mean, we went to, during lockdown, went to Dorset quite a bit and sort of southwest of England, very picturesque county. You expect to see sort of like talking woodland creatures wearing suits and stuff. That kind of, everyone is so unbelievably old. I mean, I'm in the youngest, second percentile of age if I go anywhere. It's really, really noticeable. And I think it's only become, this kind of demographic shift's only really become noticeable in the last 3 or 4 years, where everyone's just getting used to. I mean, I'm not sort of the advice giving type. I like to write about what I think is happening in the world, but I don't really want to give prescriptive themes. But clearly that is obviously an issue that someone needs to seriously think about.
Yeah, I think there's a comment to one of your articles on kind of the demographic collapse, and it was from a woman, and she said I have 10 children. I don't know
Right, yeah.
whether I'll have any grandchildren. My oldest daughter is engaged at 31, and the rest have pets and their siblings for company. I mean,
Sure, she's bound to have some, right? If you have 10 kids, like
I mean,
that's
I
something
I hope
you'd be
the thing
very
is
surprised and end up with nothing.
I it is kind of weird. Maybe it's just a quirk of my friend group, but there's just so few children being had, and even the people who are trying to have them are having a lot of trouble because they're starting very late, and
Yeah,
even with the best of intentions, like just you can't engineer biology to that point. It's I don't know. It's really scary. Um, yeah, and it is a sort of at least in my assessment, it's kind of this spiritual malaise, because it's like it's housing market plays a a role as well, and but we're definitely much richer than our ancestors. I mean, my grandparents lived in just like incomparable squalor, and the Red Army was mowing down their neighbors and things like that, and still there were like 10 of them. So it is uncomfortable, and it is a complete overhaul of your life if you're just kind of just a modern individual trying to get by and make enough money
yeah.
and buy the things that need to be bought and climb up the status ladder. But um, yeah, I don't know. It's shocking to me that really this is kind of the situation we're in, and you kind of have to, because people tell me like, oh, you shouldn't be having children for ideological reasons. But at this point, what exactly should the reason be? Like, because the idea that you're just gonna rely on basic instincts doesn't seem to be working, because we've overridden all our basic instincts with all sorts of layers of
Yeah.
intermediation through tech or medication or something.
Do people, so you mean like by ideological reasons you shouldn't have kids just because it's sort of for, multiply, spread forth and multiply, sort of, because having large families is a good thing? I mean, is that,
Yeah, it's like, you should kind of just do it, but I feel like we're kind of at a point where it's a bit hard to just do it. Like, for example, if I just went with the flow of what was laid in front of me, and I didn't necessarily think about this, and decide that this is a good thing for me, and just
yeah.
kind of almost philosophically decide to have
Well, you never
children.
would. It's never the right time. I mean, that is the thing, isn't it? Some people, it's often say it's not the right time. It's never the right time. I mean, it's huge inconvenience. I have to say, they do get a lot more expensive, shockingly expensive after like 7 or 8. Like when you have kids first, because I don't know, we ended up with loads of like hand-me-downs. I mean, I must have bought like 4 items of clothing for my kids, and baby foods, and they end up using leftovers. But then all of a sudden, it's partly the expectations uh, of social groups. I think the only way you can have large families and it to be economical is to hang out with other sort of weird bohemian Catholic types. You have who like live in genteel poverty, which does exist. But in most cases, once I found there's like an arms race. You know, things that even at children's parties, everything becomes more and more expensive because of a sort of competition to a status composition. And that's, I mean, apparently um, that is considered probably one of the most likely reasons why. So, you know, so France basically went through demographic transition about 100 years before everyone else. And it started with the aristocracy who started having very small families, like as far back as the 17th century. And the main reason considered is that the cost of society, like the cost of going to parties and being seen as a member of aristocratic life, made having children who are very expensive as well, just, you know, too expensive. So people ended up having smaller and smaller families amongst the aristocracy, and that spread amongst the rest of France, which had a huge. And I think that is another kind of factor in urban societies. Having children is very expensive. I mean, I agree. There is a spiritual thing. There is a kind of one. You need to have a sort of desire. I don't know. I mean, say I suppose it is kind of egotistical, but it's a kind of belief in posterity as well, isn't it? I think if you think about your ancestors, I always think that's probably quite a good way of thinking about it. Your ancestors all struggled for you to be here. And they all, you know, I mean, if you're talking about recent Eastern European history, they struggled a lot. But if you go a few generations back, they all struggled in incredible, difficult circumstances just so we could sort of be there. So I think there is a feeling that you want to pass on, continue the chain, because there is kind of meaning in life. Sorry, this is getting a bit too like wacky and spiritual, isn't it? But that's if I have any kind of profound thoughts about it deep down, that's what I think. That, you know, I would like them. I also, there's an example like a couple of years ago, I was on holiday with my wife's family, and her and her siblings and her dad's and mum were all talking about their granny who died like 15 years ago. And they spent the whole evening, I didn't know her, so the conversation wasn't particularly interesting for me. She died like 15 years ago, and they spent the whole evening laughing and talking about her. And it's just such a nice idea that, you know, years after you're gone, people will talk about you like that. I guess that's a very like older, you know, almost like a Viking way of looking at it. Like you sort of achieve immortality if people still talk about you. But I think that's just such a lovely thought, because when it comes down to it, everything else is kind of forgotten about, isn't it? Really, like most people, unless you, I don't know, win a Nobel Prize or something, most people's careers or anything else is kind of slightly less important than the sort of relationship they have with their family.
Exactly. And it's very hard to know how you'll feel about your children before you have them. Because I think like even a lot of people would describe motherhood and things like that. Even more liberal types who say, oh, you know, it's really hard and there's a lot of problems and stuff like that. But at the end, the conclusion is typically, oh, I wouldn't have it any other way, except for, you know, some more psychopathic people who write about this.
Yeah, you don't. I mean, no one. I suppose very few people regret it, don't they? That's the thing. But I suppose that sort of, I don't know. It's philosophically that's hard to say, because once something happens, it happens. I don't know. Yeah, I didn't think people would regret that. But I mean, I don't think it's something that can be, I don't know, resolved by laws or even tax benefits.
No, it doesn't seem so.
It's also very, I don't know. It's a sensitive issue. Without, this is probably as progressive as I will ever get. Is that I understand? It's, as a man, I feel like there are certain things I don't really. I should be very careful about talking about, because it's like fundamental, like the deepest thing. The woman's sort of fertility and, you know, reproduction, and it's, this debate does, you know, can provoke huge amounts of anger or upset when people talk about it in that way.
Yeah, you're being very British about this.
I don't know. It's just like I didn't have to go through. I mean, you know, I was there, but I didn't have to go through childbirth, for example. And I would say I think it's, in a lot of cases, a lot of people, a lot of women feel a lot of regret if they don't have children. It's kind of very sensitive, kind of sad subject, I think. And that's not always because they left it late or they didn't want to. Sometimes they just can't, or, you know, I don't know, life gets in the way, whatever.
Of course.
I mean, I don't know, from what I can tell, the only like successful example of a country which has reversed this problem by just kind of cultural changes, Georgia. So and they got the archbishop. I mean, the metropolitan, the head of the church, baptizes every child. So they make every parent feel that, you're meeting a celebrity here. You're very special. Everything's about you for the day. You're wonderful. So and they managed to get it down from up from 1.4 or something to 2.1. Like Hungary and Czechia have done quite well, but they're not at that level. And I think Britain is very, very unreligious. So I don't think that would really have the same impact. You need to do something like more British. You need to get them. They get to go out to stand in front of the middle of Old Trafford or something. Each parent, I don't know. You make them the celebrity for the day.
Yeah, favorite Love Island contestant baptized as a baby.
Yeah, Love Island. Right.
Yeah, it is a hard thing to kind of reverse engineer, because it's, in a way, with all the kind of layers of intermediary things and social pressures, technological pressures. I think a lot of children also just happened. I mean, just without the pill and things like that. I think now it's very much a decision, and you kind of have to weigh all the costs and benefits. And God, are there many costs, both social and financial? And back in the day, not only would children happen, but they would be an economic plus. I mean, you wouldn't be able to have a household without them. So, yeah, I mean, there's probably has to be some sort of ideological lever that we can pull, because it seems that, I don't know if without total economic collapse, I don't see where how we return to kind of the same state, forgetting about our technology and things like that, and kind of would have to be.
I do find it strange, and it makes me feel very much I am not an organized elite member of the sort of ruling class, because I'm just too disorganized and chaotic. But people who sort of say, oh, we're going to plan a child in spring 2024, so we're going to, and it's also like just when all the financial things sort of move in place, or even a lot of people who plan their children. So in England, the child's born between September and November because you have a slight educational advantage. That level of seriousness about it, I find very hard to say, because I just think we're mostly just a long line of accidents, right? So you've got to be slightly fatalistic after a while. It's like, it's the will of God, whatever. It happens.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at least that, at least a little bit of, I don't know. I think that just kind of involves a certain rigor, and also it's very hard to actually, these things don't really happen exactly when you plan them. I don't know. Yeah, it's there's a whole thing. Another thing that you have written on, and I think is quite interesting. And I mean, it's interesting. It's absolutely terrible. Is a kind of the grooming gang scandals, which. I used to live in the UK when kind of the stories broke, and it was very jarring to think that this could happen, and that it was still happening. And that's, as far as I can understand, it's probably still happening. There's not really any.
Yeah, as far as it's definitely. I mean, it's definitely still happening. It's when I first heard about it. I mean, it was actually first really spoken about. People spoke about it, but it emerged amongst. It was spoken about by members of the BNP, who are sort of pretty extreme right wing. I mean, they are pretty neo-Nazi, and that in the latest reports it involves. So I don't know how many your listeners know the UK. The Oldham's in Lancashire. It's an old cotton town, and it really is quite a sort of classic. It was once basically the centre of the cotton world, and then obviously that went and it's sort of fallen half times, and has quite a large-ish Pakistani minority. And this latest report, they mentioned the far right 15 times. This is the people. So every time they're saying, "Wow, so we knew this girl was being gang raped by this gang. We knew, and she was basically just being, pushed around and like grossly mistreated. And but we can't make this big issue because it will embolden the far right or help the far right, and the far right hear about this. And after a while, I think, well, like, is your job to basically to stop children getting raped, or is it to, look after the national discourse so it doesn't get extreme? Like, after a while, I think, what will you do to stop the far right? I mean, like, you'll go to almost any length to avoid this issue, and I mean, we don't know the full numbers, but I mean, it's obviously in total, we're talking at least probably 5,000 girls. Most of them come from like very, very poor backgrounds, often in care, not they don't have sort of family members look after them. And you know, the strangest thing is, you know, a lot of social workers knew that they were, you know, they had these boyfriends going out. These girls are like 13 or 14. Their boyfriends are in their 20s. That's not boyfriend, that's a pedophile. And it was allowed, some of them were even, in some towns, were even given contraception, because in Britain, we had a ruling 30 years ago that children are allowed to be given contraception without the consent of any parents or adults, which was a very, very foolish foolish mistakes, it turned out. And this has been going on. And it's just very strange that, I mean, I read about it a couple of weeks ago. It's like, when we think of the Victorian era, we don't immediately think of their huge engineering, you know, achievements, or their huge strides, or their incredible transformation society. We tend to like think of things like the workhouse and Oliver Twist and those kind of really, really, really squalid, horrific stories of poverty, because they've kind of been imprinted in the memory through Charles Dickens's work. And I just wonder if, you know, in a few hundred years' time, when people write about our age, the second Elizabethan age, especially the late second Elizabethan age, you know, which starts with really Blair, well, is this what they're going to remember? Because I mean, there's like literally nothing in our history which is like this. There's nothing in the Victorian era which is as bad as this. They're like the kind of almost institutional gang rape of girls in their teens. It's just, there, you know, there was like a child prostitution in London in the 9th century, as there was in almost any city, and they clamped down on it. You know, the press it was one of the great sort of tabloid journalistic campaigns, and that's what caused the age of consent to be raised to 16 to stop this happening. I mean, but this is just, I mean, unbelievable, really, and almost, you know, very little has been done to stop it. I mean, interesting. I mean, even one of the leaders of the gangs, I think it was in Oldham, might be in Rochdale, which is another town nearby, has been able to avoid deportation. I mean, lots of them have been able to avoid deportation. Like, so most of the gang, they're either Pakistani born or second generation Pakistanis. And if, you know, a lot of it has been sort of basically underplayed or just sort of put to one side. It's just kind of an inconvenient issue. And I generally think it's like it's just the most mind-blowingly horrible thing that's happened in Britain in the last 30 years. There's very little that can be said about it.
Yeah, I think that's because your value system doesn't see emboldening the far right as the biggest evil. I feel like,
No, you know, I think about this. Well, you know, with Britain, like, Britain is a country, like Britain, like by any standards, is very unracist, which is a good quality. You know, that kind of social tolerance is a good quality in any country. You look at, you know, it comes up again with the list of Tory candidates, which, you know, I think basically half of them are from non-white backgrounds. But, you know, public tolerance is a very like soft virtue. It's not very difficult virtue, for example. I mean, I'm writing something now comparing to, you know, it's like personal tolerance is much harder. Like, you know, living with someone is much harder than accepting members of different ethnic groups in your street or neighborhood, because that's just a very far away, sort of, you know, a weak virtue. But it's a virtue nonetheless. It's good to live in an unraised society. But also, any virtue taken to extremes becomes a vice. I mean, yes, we have very unraised society, but, you know, we jail people for making racist jokes in private WhatsApp groups. I mean, we're obsessed by the subject. And, you know, worst of all, we allow thousands of girls to be raped because people are scared of racism. I mean, I happen to believe, I think there is probably definitely a link between what happened in all these towns. Like Rotherham was the worst case. And in the late 90s, there was a big kind of investigation stroke show trial into racism in the police in London. There was a Macpherson report that came out of inquiry. It was a horrible murder of a young black teenager in London in the early 90s called Stephen Lawrence, very famous in the UK. The police failed to prosecute the suspects. Later, it was a campaign with the Daily Mail, actually, which got them done. And there was this huge kind of inquiry, and it basically said the police are institutionally racist. I mean, no doubt there is racism in the police. And it made public officials terrified of anything which will get them in trouble on this issue. And I do believe, I'm pretty sure that must have influenced people as they were, hearing rumors about what was going on in the north of England. Amazing things like, racism is, you might call it a sin, or it's a vice, or it's at any rate a sort of negative trait. But you have to put everything into context. You have to balance all the virtues, and we take it to this extreme level.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily, because you can see this in the U.S. as well, kind of with the difference
Course,
between
yeah.
the conservatives and the liberals. I mean, both of them have autonomy as a core value, but the rest of the virtues are maybe ranked differently. It's not that
Sure.
I guess conservatives are very racist. They're just not keen to put racism on top, 10 levels above every other vice. Yeah, so I think it's and also I think that's why they lose, because when you put one virtue above, on the pedestal above every other virtue, you kind of have a moral fervor that just doesn't compare, in the opposite party, because the opposite party essentially accepts your premises. They say, oh, racism is a vice, and then they just kind of bludgeon themselves to death with the problem, with this kind of just accepting the same framing, but not bringing the same, power and moral righteousness to
Right, so they're just offering a weaker product, Diet Coke, or whatever.
Exactly. Oh, we have 2005 Coke. Wasn't it nicer in 2005? No, we want the permanent revolution looks much better than 2005 brand Coke.
I think that is a problem with conservative housing. Why couldn't we have just stopped it this like 6 years ago? Well, no, because why couldn't we have stopped the revolution in 1792? I mean, it was because it's inevitably going to get worse. Whereabouts in the UK did you live, by the way, of interest?
I lived in London, yeah. I lived in East London. I lived in Hackney. I lived in Walthamstow for a while, Haringey, just like different bits.
Walthamstow's become very fancy, hasn't it? Apparently.
It wasn't that fancy when I moved there.
The Victorian part is quite fancy, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a little bit, and I used to kind of walk there because I lived literally in the apartment blocks next to Walthamstow Central Station, next to the bus stop, and it was it was a bit more rowdy at night. I had one guy there who was yelling Allahu Akbar for about a week, all night long, just like all night.
It's like my lovely urban setting, just listening to my neighbor, a mentally ill man with an obsession with his land. Just what you want.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's just the sound of London, isn't it? I mean, East London was. I mean, remember there was about 5 years ago. So one of my crazy ideas that I'm a bit of a supermarket. I think they're called the Tesco truthers. The people. So some people believe there are like millions more people in Britain than the actual officials let on. And like the true conspiracy theorists think it's like 20 million more. I think it's probably like 3 million more. But about 5 or 6 years ago, it turned out there were these houses in, I think there was something like Redbridge or Ilford or something, where there were Romanian workers. There were sort of 25 guys living in a 3-bedroom house. And it turned out to be, okay, I mean, they were young guys, that's fine. They'll probably move on and blah, blah, blah. But it turned out this is happening like quite a lot. I'm not saying like Romanians, by the way. I mean, like it's nothing. It's not.
Man, I think I've been to one of those houses. I had friends who lived in.
I mean, they're just trying. London is very expensive, and they're just trying to make a living. There's nothing wrong there. But there also, it turns out, in the West, there were like near Heathrow Airport, this whole lot of line of like sheds where people were living in sheds. And although I'm actually literally in a shed right now, but I don't live. And I thought that's kind of a bit squalid and dystopian. That's a bit depressing. Like people shouldn't have to live like that. I mean, it should be, I don't know. It should be, and that's kind of the scene I see in London becoming this kind of great if you're kind of wealthy, and just hellish if you're poor. And that's the kind of, I don't know, that's the society I don't really want to live in. I don't really think we need to accept. We don't, people shouldn't have to live in those kind of conditions. It could be like resolvable. Yeah, but there we go. But I mean,
Yeah, I think a lot of people who live in those houses essentially see going to the UK as kind of like a temporary deal where they,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
go there and I don't know, do Uber or maybe engage in some petty criminality or less so, and then make their money and then go home and build a house there. Just kind of use the fact that their labor is worth more.
Sure.
And
I mean, if that works for them, I mean, I did feel that Brexit was basically a reaction to that kind of development. This kind of there's also a thing, the sort of latifundia style, strawberry picking things. I mean, even during the pandemic, they were lobbying, these groups and lobbies, and we've got to fly in 20,000 fruit pickers from Romania to say, listen, like if you can't pay people a decent wage, mechanize or do something else with that land. Like it's not worth this situation. I mean, it doesn't even make sense for Britain to particularly grow its own strawberries. But this whole situation, and the weirdest thing is that this kind of system where you're importing stoop labor, and if you go through this one, go through all the reports and then BBC's do the worst for this, there'll be no mention of wages. You search through, say wages. Where is the mention of wages? Like you're not getting local people to work here because you're not paying enough. It's like a grossly weird and unfair system. You're importing people from 2,000 miles away to work in these terrible conditions. Now I know that sounds, I've written about it before. I mean, that sounds patronizing because like my ancestors like migrated from different parts of the British Isles, from the west of Ireland and the north of England, looking for a better income and life improved. So I mean, there is the other side of that. If you can work in those quality conditions, maybe in 5 years' time you're going to be earning decent money, or you'd have made enough money to actually invest in home. I'm just not
yeah.
convinced that actually happens that much. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it happens for some people. It also kind of destroys. There's a certain kind of commons aspect, even to places that you go to. Like for example, if you're a Romanian, who wants to work in London, you can go to London and not have to interact with an English speaking person at all. You can just go to Romaniaville and work in a Romanian shop and talk to Romanian people, do Romanian business, kind of in the soup of London, but not really in London.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are also kind of they're skeptical about the UK. They feel like the UK is racist. Essentially, 'cause that's kind of also what the media says. The British are racist. We don't interact with them because they're racist. They don't
Well,
like us here.
Romanian.
Yeah, there's a lot of, especially I'm like, you're white. What do you mean? So, but no, just like this whole concept of kind of ethnic animus that they don't want us here, and that's why I'm also justified in essentially just making a quick buck and then just leaving this country.
I don't think there is that. I mean, I don't know. I'm probably the wrong social class to judge. I do think, and this is probably quite controversial, a lot of the media discourse, you can see a lot of tabloid articles about Romanians in the past hasn't really been about Romanians. If without at this point is a man with his umbrella hooking me away to say stop talking. So I think there's
No worries. This is a safe
amongst the
space.
public there is some sort of confusion about what they mean by Romanians, but I don't think. I mean, I don't know if the average person would distinguish a Romanian from someone else in Central or Eastern Europe. I don't know. I think there was a certain thing once migration from Central Europe was very large from 2004, much more than people anticipated. Our government said there'd be between 5 and 13,000 a year. Now, there was over 1 million in 3 or 4 years. I mean, part of me just thinks, how can the people run the system be so incompetent and so you could have asked. I mean, I guess the internet non didn't exist in those days.
It
But you
makes
could ask the
sense.
internet nons, and they would get a much more
Yeah.
accurate
But it makes
prediction.
sense if you look at the pedestal and look at what's on the pedestal and it says emboldening the far right is what you want to avoid.
Yeah.
So obviously they're going to lie to you about things that would embolden the far right. All their
I hope that's
ideas.
the case. I hope they're not just incompetent and they have no idea how migration patterns work.
It's bad either way, to be honest.
No, exactly. There's two choices. But I mean, I think that would have been fine if it was just slightly managed more. I mean, as they did in most countries, there was sort of basically there were kind of pause, there were breaks, and there were slight restrictions. I think in Britain they were just surprised by the size of change. I don't. I mean, I haven't picked up much hostility towards Eastern Europeans generally.
Yeah,
Maybe a
I
bit more
don't think
towards
there is.
Romanian Poles, but even not that much though.
I don't think there is. I mean, to be honest, and maybe it's also, like I said, it's also kind of a class thing as well. Because I worked in tech, and in those circles, you're kind of a little bit of you're special if you're from beyond the aisles. No, maybe also as a woman in tech, whatever that means. There's another layer of intersectional specialty added to my stack or something like that. But I was always treated with kind of almost deference by other people, especially after Brexit. They were all kind of like, coming to me cap in hand saying, "I'm sorry, I didn't want this to happen. It's not my fault. I voted correctly." So yeah.
I think if you're middle class and educated, that you always have a slightly different. I mean, that sounds like my mum's experience of coming to London in the 60s, where she was, from a middle class South Dublin. She spoke in a quite slightly more refined way. And her experience, she didn't like, when people talk about, the experience of like poor Irish migrants in London being told, no Irish, no blacks, no dogs, like that's just a world away from her. She'd never experienced those worlds. And, even working class Londoners would be slightly deferential to her because she's middle class, and that kind of outranks anything. So, that does sound like your background is going to affect how you see things.
Yeah, and I can see, like, for example, if you interact with kind of working class British people and you don't speak the language, and you also kind of, I don't know, are squatting in a tracksuit next to your BMW and stuff like that, and act in very stereotypical ways, maybe people will be like, this guy's not from here, and you might have an interaction that's not favorable. But I just don't know.
Are the Romanians also into squatting? I mean, I know it's the
love
it. Right, so the Poles love to squat, and obviously the Russians love to squat, but
we squat too, yeah, and we love tracksuits, different kinds, stripy ones.
And Red Bull, drinking Red Bull, that's the other thing. I guess that's the other.
Red Bull, yeah. I think people love Monster here for some reason.
Monster,
I don't know.
Of course, that's more decent.
Monster is good. I don't know. I feel like the Russians are kind of have taken this to an extreme. Like whenever you see like someone who's extremely like meme type of the gopnik, the squatter, the guy, he's probably Russian. But kind of the intermediary types where you see kind of semi, that's probably from kind of closer to the west. Even some Hungarians closer to Romania do that as well. So yeah, there's all sorts of variations on the same theme.
Someone needs to do a squatting map of Europe, just the levels, just to
exactly to know the kind of squatting physiognomy and the types of tracksuits that correspond to each region.
I think the tracksuit thing might be fascinating. It'll be like sort of like Clan Tartan, wouldn't it? Right? I mean,
exactly. I mean, the tracksuit thing was just that it was the only kind of branded stuff, which was obviously branded, that you could kind of get after communism or even before. Some people would get it even before, but yeah, it's and I think it's also because a lot of kind of 70s culture was imprinted on kind of the collective consciousness of Romania, because everything was kind of retarded in the medical sense that we were like 5, 10, 20 years behind, and kind of the 70s image of the guy with a fluffy hair and an Adidas full body tracksuit kind of was a high status thing, what Americans used to wear. And
were mullets big like they were in East Germany? Was that? I don't think I remember when I see footage of 1989. I don't visualize lots of mullets like I do in Germany, where they're all climbing over the wall with massive back.
Not that much. I think there was kind of a 90s little like brief mullet phase, but no, I think we've passed that very, very quickly.
That's just as well.
Well, on that cheery note, and on that taxonomy of the Eastern types, I want to ask you the question of the show, which is, do you have a subversive thinker that you think is underrated, that people should find out about, read more of, or generally check out?
A subversive thinker. I've actually I don't actually know who he is, but I've come to read the NS Lyons substack. Have you heard of him?
No.
Very good. I don't know. I mean, he seems kind of normal to me, so it's hard to tell. Like, is someone like too edgy to mention? But I don't know. But
there's no one too edgy to mention on this show. Feel free. I don't know him, but I'll check him out. If that's that's a great forewarning.
It's called the Upheaval. It's very interesting. He basically his kind of most celebrated essay, he looks at, what causes the current like progressive overreach, and is this kind of just liberalism taken to its normal sort of extent, as sort of post liberals have it, or is this a kind of is this an anti-liberal movement? And he just, he dissects the intellectual division. I mean, obviously he's on the post-liberal side in that thing, but he argues it very well. His latest thing is a piece on Francis Fukuyama on his liberalism and his discontent. So it's an interesting analysis. I'd recommend. I don't actually know who he is. I think it's not even his real name. So I don't know if you can even have him on unless you want to have it as sort of, SAS style distorted voice message.
Yeah, I mean, I've had quite a few on with distorted voices and all that. So, yeah, I think that's excellent. I mean, that sounds like definitely up my alley and the show's alley, and whoever listens to this is going to be interested in that. That's great. I haven't heard of him, but we'll put it in the show notes.
Check him out.
Perfect.
Or maybe it's a woman. Maybe it's a woman pretending to be a man. I don't know.
Yeah, could be. I'm happy that you hedged that just to make sure. Yeah, could even be a non-binary person.
We don't know.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Ed. This was lovely, and it's been a long time coming. I've been reading your work for a while. Wonderful writer, and please do check out all of Ed's work, his books, Small Men on the Wrong Side of History, and The Diversity Illusion, and of course the Substack, The Wrong Side of History.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you so much.